Let's get started. Our story no longer expected to feel like this. When she walked into that dimly lit room, she felt as if the air had changed. Heavy, almost suffocating, and there she was right in front of her old one, of that red perched on a tripod like a silent observer. Of course she had used that damn camera. He never went anywhere without it, recording everything as if life needed to be documented from every angle. This was different. He was standing more behind it, adjusting the lens as if he owned the moment. Before continuing the story, I ask you for a second to give a like to the video. It doesn't bother you at all and it helps me a lot. Let's continue. Such a smile. It was innocent, it had that edge, that sly smile it always gave. When he thought no one was looking at him predatory, that's what he was. You could see it in the way eyes flickered over her. He was already undressing her in his mind, as if this was his show and she was going to the centerpiece. Her husband, oh, her dear beloved husband, leaned close, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered. "It's just a game. They'll just watch." But was it really just a game? There was a tremor in her chest, that visceral feeling you know when everything inside you screamed that something was wrong. But you'd already taken a step too far to turn around the room. It was not empty. Slowly, as if they had been summoned, her friends, they began to gather one by one. They entered, their eyes fixed on her, as if they had been waiting for this. She could feel, or immediately has been, thick attention, almost visible the way their eyes were clinging, and their hungry devouring. They were not even hiding it, and there she was in it. Center of it all, fully clothed but exposed in a way that made her hair stand on end. Europanos meant nothing under those eyes. Her husband, he was different this night. He stood back looking at her with a gaze so cold it was as if he wasn't even there, distant, as if he weren't even going to his wife for their vulnerable under the weight of his attention. "Trust my son again." But how could she, that distant look in his eyes? He told her everything and she had already made up her mind, and prayerfully, at least not tonight anymore. God, that man gave a step forward, just a slight movement, but it was enough to break the illusion of control. Of two brushed her arm and she felt it. Her heart raced, but not from emotion. No, this was something else. This was the moment. The boundaries they had talked about collapsed, and her husband didn't even blink. He didn't do anything, didn't stop him, didn't intervene as if he wanted this as quote, or this was part of the plan. The other men in the room moved or needed permission in Mada's move had said enough. All was said, but the rules were done, they were gone, and she was trapped in it, and straight from wires mo controlly. Whatever twisted game her husband had set up, there was no turning back. She began to unravel so fast, almost as if the moment Matt's fingers brushed against her skin, the rules dissolved into thin air as if they had never existed. First of all, he could feel the change in the room, couldn't he? Like a spoken agreement, passed between them all, and she knew it, or she knew what was coming next, and she didn't even hesitate. She moved with that quiet confidence of hers. Like she'd been here before, like this was just another normal night. His hands weren't just hesitant, they were now more assertive, more invasive. And she stood there frozen, as the others approached. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as if they were waiting for something, but what? For her to protest, to break, but she didn't move. She didn't say a word because her husband had told her to be still, and wasn't she always the obedient one? Oh, the camera was still there, wearing away, capturing every flash of emotion on her face. Every tremor in her body, as Matt's hands traveled further and her husband didn't stop him, he just looked at God. The betrayal must have felt like a knife in her chest. I was afraid. I wasn't afraid to disobey the man I had promised to follow, afraid to break the invisible chain of control I had always had over her. Her mind, poor thing, was racing now. You could almost hear it, couldn't you? Those moments of control, flashes before her eyes, every time he pulled the strings without her noticing. It was as if the truth had been there all along, hidden in the shadows, waiting for this exact moment to come to light. He had always been in control. Always, and she had been his pawn. And then, or at the time she heard it, one of her friends made a somewhat low and crude comment, something she couldn't understand, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the sound that came next. Her husband laughed, not a full laugh, just a soft chuckle under his breath. As if he found the whole thing amusing, and it sent a shiver straight through her. Oh. Because that laugh confirmed it all. Ma's touch. It made Boulder wave his hands with a kind of aggression that hadn't been there before. And yet, her husband did nothing. He just sat watching as if this was a twisted spectacle. He was directing the weight of his eyes on her. It was unbearable. She could feel them all now. Watching her pass between them like an object, as if she was no longer human, and that's when the real change happened. Another one of her friends stepped forward, crossing that final boundary, his hands matting together, and you could see it in his face, couldn't you? The moment he realized there was no turning back. Now, everyone was involved. The rules, the ones they had agreed to, were never real. She was in this completely, with no escape. Her eyes moved to her husband, again, waiting, hoping he would stop them. But what did he do? He didn't scream, didn't get angry, didn't run to her rescue, didn't light a cigarette, just leaned back in his chair and watched distantly. Amused, as if he was enjoying it, as if this was all part of a sick game he had set in motion. And that was when he realized, wasn't it? That this wasn't just a one-time thing. No. This had been wearing for a while. She was confused or humiliated. But more than anything, she was starting to get on her feet. She had always been just another possession for the something, to be used or something, to be shared. The night was far from over. But at that moment she was no longer the same woman who had walked into that room. The camera was still recording, the men were still circling, and her husband was still watching, but inside something had broken, and the story, oh. Toria was just getting started. You know how things get worse and no one stops them. That's exactly where we are now. Matt O was in full director mode. He wasn't adjusting that camera, making sure every angle was perfect, every movement registered. His hands were busy, but not with her anymore. He had something else on his mind. The men were doing enough on their own. There was no need to rush, no need to interrupt. She wanted to capture every second, every flash of discomfort, every reluctant shiver that recurred her spine. She had become the voyeur, the one documenting her slow descent into whatever this had become. And then she saw herself there on that little screen on the back of the camera. Just a shadow of the woman who had once been powerless. His reflection was no longer even his own. It was his creation. Strange, a nightmare, was not a twisted game she could escape from. She was trapped in it like a fly caught in a web, and they were all spiders slowly kicking at her bit by bit. You'd think her husband would step in now, wouldn't you? But no, he joined Matt behind the camera. Her eyes focused on the screen, reviewing the footage as a sort of yes-in film until her master hour near zoom said, instructing Matt with a calmness that chilled her to the core, directing the scene, making sure every moment was preserved, every hadio, every helpless stare. The men circled her like predators, each touch more invasive than the last. She asked, each hand pushing her further from the edge of complete submission, and her husband just watched. Did she ever really know him if she had been blind all this time, pretending not to see the signs, all those moments that felt wrong, but she pushed them away, because that's what love is right about. Sit down, it makes you ignore the cracks until they swallow you up. Her whole mind began to wander. She was floating about the room now, dissociating, seeing herself, becoming nothing more than her entertainment in her sick game. This was how it was supposed to end. Was this what it had always been? She could no longer feel her body. Just numbness, watching the scene unfold from somewhere far away, and then Matt, ever watchful, shifted the focus of the camera, leaned in and whispered something to her husband. Something that sent a ripple of cold through his body, caught a fragment. This was always the plan. Her breath caught in her throat. Always from the beginning, this was never a one-time thing. It was him. He'd sprung a trap on her and she'd walked right into it, trusting him like the fool she'd become. The camera flash went off, blinding her for a moment, and when her vision cleared, she saw him. Her husband right in front of the lens, now smiling that smile as if he had finally won some twisted game he didn't even know he was playing, and the worst part, he didn't even try to hide it anymore. He stood there proud of what he had done, what he had turned. She and one of the men crossed the room, whispering something to her husband or something. Quiet, almost intimate, and then they both gave each other. It was soft, casual, like two old friends sharing a joke while drinking, but this was no joke, not to her. To them it was the punchline of a dark comedy, and she was the joke. And that's when the ultimate betrayal happened, and she already saw it in his eyes. He needed him to talk. She felt just a small gesture, but it was her enough permission. She had given them permission for what came next, and now there was no way to stop it. Everything was falling apart now, and she knew it. Every man in that room had become part of the show, each one waiting his turn, like a grotesque ritual. She was no longer a person, not to them, not to her husband. She was an object, the center of attention, the entertainment of their evenings, and the worst part, she was directing everything, was there, quiet, as always, camera in hand. Making sure she didn't miss any details, her best friend Matt took the lead in guiding the others. But her husband didn't just watch, he signed every second that camera had seen. All the close-ups were the most brutal. It didn't just capture her body, it captured her face, the way her expression changed from disbelief to horror, the shame etched into her skin, the lingering fear in her eyes, and there, right in the middle of it all, the betrayal. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. You could see it. The camera zoomed in on her broken spirit and that gleam in her eyes that was the last of her hope dying. And then, when she couldn't hold it in anymore, she screamed. It was not a protest. In reality, it was more like an explosion of everything I had bottled up. Impotence, anger, betrayal? But instead of stopping, the room erupted in laughter. Laughter as her pain, her humiliation, was the punchline of her joke. And there, in the middle of it all, his wife's friends mocked her, calling her the fool, always thinking she had a choice in this, as if she'd ever had a say. But he, or not, didn't even flinch. He didn't look guilty. He didn't flinch, his hands were steady on the camera, as if this was just another scene to add to his collection. His eyes were fixed on the lens emotionlessly. No regrets at all, he was just capturing the perfect shot by getting the right angle. How had he not seen it before? This was his creation. This was what he wanted all along. And then, as if it couldn't get any worse, Matt, ever the opportunist, spoke up. "Let me change it," he said casually. Make him look at the camera, and of course, he had no choice but to obey. They made sure the camera zoomed in again, this time closer, showing every flash of emotion as she paraded in front of it, her uncovered humiliation for them to enjoy again and again. You see, every inch of her shame was now etched, a permanent reminder of the night it was all taken from her. Of course, she tried to cover herself, to claim something, but her husband's voice pierced the room. Like a blade, remembering the promise he made to her. Your voice was cold and commanding, and she knew exactly what he meant. He had promised her he wouldn't do it, no matter how far he went, and now there was no turning back. There was no escape, only obedience. Men, of course, had stopped caring about rules a long time ago. Those invisible lines they had supposedly agreed upon were just that, invisible. Every touch pushed her further away, every hand violated her space, every movement pulled her deeper into their control. It wasn't even about her anymore, it was about them, about how far they could go, how much they could take from her before she broke completely. "Matt, your hands were the roughest." He leaned close enough for only her to hear and whispered something that sent a shiver through her bones. "It was never going to stop us," he said, his voice dripping with malice, and that's when it hit her. It really hit her. I had never once been in control. This was no accident. This was not a game that had gone too far. Her husband had set it up from the beginning. Every touch, every moment, every whispered word had been planned. She was always meant to make his entertainment, and now it finally was. Realizing it was too late, the camera was still rolling, capturing every moment of her, unraveling every bit of her that was left to give, and they were all watching, all enjoying, and he was directing it, all his perfect masterpiece. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all night. The room was already filled with tension, but now it was something completely different. The way they were moving, the way they were touching her, it wasn't just about crossing lines anymore. No, this was about pushing her to a place she never imagined she could go, and her husband was there, urging them on. That camera recording without pause, never once hesitating, was filming every second, making sure to capture her at her most vulnerable moment, at her breaking point. She had been strong, but now the weight of her hands, the laughter, the way her husband watched unblinkingly, it was too much. Her strength gave out, her body, her mind, both surrendered to the inevitable. She was nothing but a shell in front of them, now completely exposed, powerless, and all she could feel were his eyes on her. Watching, absorbing every last bit of what was left. That's when she looked at him. Her husband didn't speak, didn't offer her any words of comfort, just that cold, distant look. And for a brief moment, just a second, she saw him, the man she used to know, the one she loved. But before he could catch it, he disappeared again, slipping behind that camera, hiding behind the lens. As he had been doing all along, he was no longer her husband, he was the director, and she was the star of his twisted matte production. He came back, of course, he took over the camera, zooming in, focusing on her face, her eyes, where he was savoring this, the way her despair shone, the way her spirit broke in front of the lens. He was capturing it all, and you could see her husband in the background, just standing there, letting not a word or a sound happen. Then one of the men, bold as ever, spoke, his low dark voice suggesting something that made even her stomach turn back, something darker, or something even more degrading than what they had already done, and her husband noted just a simple, barely perceptible nod, but permission enough. Granted, and that's when it happened. Her tears came slow at first, but once they started there was no stopping them. She cried, finally breaking down in tears, hoping, praying that this was what would make them stop, that maybe, just maybe, they would see their pain, their vulnerability, and have some decency. But no, they enjoyed it, savored their tears as if it were the final piece of the puzzle, what they had been waiting for all along. Their humiliation wasn't complete until they saw her cry. Then her husband stepped forward, and for a second it almost seemed like he was going to push her away. As if maybe, just maybe, he had reached his limit, but no, that would have been too easy. Instead, his grip tightened on her arm, and instead of that, of pulling her out of this nightmare, he pushed her further into the center of the room, presenting her to him as some sort of offering. There was no escape, she was theirs now. And her husband had made sure of it, and just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the room did. It was already heavy with tension and the stench of betrayal. It became suffocating. Was her husband's voice, the one that cut through it all, finally speaking after what seemed like an eternity of silence. But it wasn't to offer comfort or a "excuse me" or not, it was something much darker, of a step forward, almost casually. His eyes never left those of, and as he said it, calm as always, this one. It had been his plan all along. That's when it hit her like a punch in the stomach. He had been recording her for years, not just tonight, not just this night, not just this room, not every intimate moment they had shared, every act, every secret encounter, all had been filmed. Unbeknownst to her, wasn't she just being used tonight? And he had been on her game from the beginning, and the worst part, he wasn't ashamed, he wasn't proud of what he had done, proud of how long he had kept up this charade. Waiting for the right moment to share her twisted collection with her friends right now. She was given, her mind racing to process it all, their entire relationship, every memory she thought cherishing, it all was a lie. Every time or every hug just another scene in his sick personal collection. She was not his wife. She was his possession, every look he had given her, every time he had held her. Europe. It had been for them betrayal. It was unlike anything she had felt before, deeper than any humiliation she had not endured. Tonight this was the final blow, and as if to finish the knife deeper, her husband did not stop. Gino began showing him scripts, old clips from years ago of her. Completely unaware, completely vulnerable, the big screen flickered in the corner of the room, and there she was, younger, naive, oblivious. She looked at herself on the screen, completely unaware of the camera's gaze, of her husband's betrayal lurking behind her, and the men watching too, their eyes glued to the screen, enjoying this as much as they had enjoyed her tonight. It wasn't just that they had recorded her, no, the real pain came at realizing that every moment she thought had been personally intimate had been for his collection, for his amusement. She had never been more than an object to him. He had never seen her as just a person or something to be filmed or something to be shared. He had shared her body tonight, but he had been sharing her soul for years. Every time or every touch, it had all been for them. And now the screen replayed their moments as a grotesque reminder of how blind I had been, of how used the betrayal had been, say. Deeper and deeper with every second footage, as she stood there helplessly exposed in more ways than one, and that was how it ended, at least by it. Always the one in control casually turned off the camera as if he had just finished filming a mundane scene. Nothing special. We have all we need, he said with that smug satisfaction in his voice. You could tell he was proud of what they had done. Proud of the footage they had collected. The other men began to move, gathering their things as if they had just finished a casual evening, getting together without a care for the debris they had left behind. Oh, Esfecho. You could see it in their eyes. The evening had gone exactly as planned. Every twisted piece of their little sadistic puzzle had fallen into place, and they were walking away as if it was just another night out. But for her, this was far from over. She loved to begin. She stood there feeling the weight of silence as each one of them left the room one by one, without even looking at her. She was no longer a person to them, just a toy they had used and discarded, and her husband stood there without moving, without saying a word, while the camera, or that damn camera, kept pointing at her. The red light kept flashing, recording, always recording. Massa capturing the aftermath of her total collapse was the final scene she needed. And she collapsed right there in front of him. It wasn't a slow collapse either, no. It was as if everything had finally hit her all at once: the betrayal, the humiliation, the realization that her whole life, their whole relationship, had been nothing more than a sick performance for his amusement. And now here she was alone with the man who had orchestrated it all, and the camera was still rolling. She fell to her knees, no longer caring what there was to care about. Her sobs filled the room. The kind of sobs that come from the depths of a place that has been shattered beyond repair, and he, her husband, just stood there watching her, falling apart, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. The cold, unfeeling camera continuing to flash, capturing every tear, every tremor, did not move or comfort her. Simply Hornberg's was left to crumble as that flashing red light continued to record the final brutal betrayal.